The US government poisoned thousands of its own citizens, bombed an entire neighborhood from the air, fed radioactive food to disabled children, and then buried every single file so deep that most Americans will go their entire lives without ever knowing it happened. And that's just the first 3 minutes of this video. 111 real, documented, history book rejected secrets that will make you question everything you were ever taught in school. Hit subscribe so you don't miss a single one. Let's go. 1. The US government looked a group of disabled children in the eye, handed them a bowl of radioactive oatmeal, and said, "Eat up, buddy." Back in the 1940s at a Massachusetts school called Fernald, scientists funded by the government and MIT secretly laced breakfast cereal with radioactive tracers and fed it to kids with mental disabilities. But parents signed consent forms that talked about a science club and special diet, but never once mentioned the word radiation. These children had no idea they were the experiment. Nobody went to jail. Nobody got fired. The study was published in a prestigious journal like it was totally normal. 2. In the 1950s, the U.S. Army looked at a map of America, pointed at the poorest black neighborhoods in St. Louis, and said, "Perfect. Teak, let's spray chemicals on those people." Operation L. AC had military planes flying low over residential housing projects, releasing zinc cadmium sulfide into the air while families went about their day. Kids played outside, and mothers hung laundry on lines. Residents had no idea. The Army claimed it was harmless, but cadmium is a known carcinogen. Researchers specifically chose these neighborhoods because they wanted to study how chemicals spread through low-income, densely packed communities. No warning, no consent, no apology for decades. 3. The lead industry knew since the 1920s that leaded gasoline was quietly turning American children's brains into mush, and they did not care even a little bit. Scientists hired by the industry stood in front of reporters, smiled confidently, and told the entire country that leaded gasoline was perfectly safe while their own private research was screaming the exact opposite. They kept this lie running for 50 years with paid scientists, fake studies, and well-funded lobbying, while 90% of American children were walking around with toxic lead levels, damaging their developing brains permanently. 4. The lead industry knew since the 1920s that leaded gasoline was quietly turning American children's brains into mush, and they did not care even a little bit. Scientists hired by the industry stood in front of reporters, smiled confidently, and told the entire country that leaded gasoline was perfectly safe, while their own private research was screaming the exact opposite. They kept this lie running for 50 years with paid scientists, fake studies, and well-funded lobbying while 90% of American children were walking around with toxic lead levels rotting their developing brains. The damage showed up as lower IQ scores, behavioral problems, and developmental issues across an entire generation of kids, and the industry just kept cashing checks. 5. A United States Army general ordered the massacre of somewhere between 200 and 1,000 Filipino civilians huddled inside a volcanic crater in 1906, and then received America's highest military honor for it. General Leonard Wood led the assault on Morro Crater in the Philippines, where men, women, and children had taken shelter, and his troops wiped out nearly everyone inside. When President Theodore Roosevelt received the casualty report, he sent Wood a personal congratulations. American newspapers back home cheered it as a great military victory. The victims were Muslim Filipinos who had refused to surrender their weapons, and the official military report described the operation as a complete success without blinking once. 6. Lyndon B. R. Johnson needed 87 votes to win his 1948 Texas Senate primary, and somehow a mysterious ballot box called Box 13 showed up at the very last minute, delivering exactly 202 votes with every single signature written in the same handwriting and listed in perfect alphabetical order, which is not how humans vote. Local political boss George Parr allegedly manufactured those ballots overnight and handed Johnson his margin of victory in what historians now openly call a stolen election. Johnson knew exactly what happened, and his opponent knew exactly what happened, but the political machinery buried it fast. The man who benefited from that stolen ballot box eventually became the President of the United States. 7. In 1873, a white militia in Colfax, Louisiana hunted down and murdered somewhere between 80 and 150 Black American men on Easter Sunday, in what became the single largest mass killing of the entire Reconstruction era. And the Supreme Court responded by using the massacre as legal justification to dismantle civil rights enforcement across the entire country. Black men who had barricaded themselves inside a courthouse were burned out, shot while surrendering, and executed on the spot. The killers walked free. The Supreme Court ruled in 1876 that the federal government could not prosecute private individuals for violating civil rights, and that ruling quietly gutted Black Americans' constitutional protections for nearly a century afterward. 8. The United States government sat down in 1958 and seriously drew up plans to blow up the moon with a nuclear bomb just to show the Soviet Union who was in charge, and one of the scientists they hired to calculate the explosion radius was a young Carl Sagan who nearly got himself in serious trouble by bragging about the top-secret project on a graduate school fellowship application. And the plan was called Project A119, and the whole idea was that if Americans could detonate a visible nuclear blast on the surface of the moon, every human being on Earth would see it and understand that the United States meant business. The moon did nothing wrong. The project was eventually canceled, but the fact that it got far enough along to have a full scientific team says everything. 9. During the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s, over 1,000 bank executives committed fully documented provable fraud that cost American taxpayers $132 billion, and virtually none of them spent meaningful time behind bars because the government decided that prosecuting wealthy bankers aggressively was somehow more complicated than prosecuting everyone else. Executives looted their own institutions, threw lavish parties with depositor money, made loans to fake companies they secretly owned, and when the whole thing collapsed, ordinary Americans picked up the bill through a government bailout while the people responsible negotiated plea deals and walked away with their vacation homes intact. The whole scandal disappeared from public conversation within a few years like it never happened. 10. Henrietta Lacks was a Black woman from Baltimore who walked into Johns Hopkins Hospital in 1951 with cervical cancer, and a doctor quietly scraped cells from her cervix without asking her permission, without telling her, and without ever informing her family because in 1951, nobody thought a poor Black woman needed to be consulted about her own body. Those stolen cells turned out to be immortal, the first human cells to survive and multiply endlessly in a lab. And they became the most commercially valuable biological material in medical history, used in the polio vaccine, cancer research, and countless pharmaceutical products worth billions of dollars. Henrietta died that same year. Her family found out what happened more than 20 years later and received absolutely nothing. 11. The Saint. St. Francis Dam in California collapsed in 1928, killing up to 600 people in one of the deadliest engineering disasters in American history. And the man who built it, Chief Engineer William Mulholland, had personally inspected the dam just hours before it failed, patted it on the back metaphorically, declared everything looked perfectly fine, and drove home for dinner while a wall of water was already beginning to work its way through the cracks. Mulholland had no formal engineering degree and had essentially taught himself on the job while building Los Angeles's entire water infrastructure. When the dam exploded that night, the flood wave wiped out entire communities downstream in minutes. He was never criminally charged, and the city of Los Angeles quietly absorbed the liability. 12. The CIA ran a program called Operation Mockingbird, where they literally paid journalists working at major American media outlets including Time Magazine, Newsweek, and CBS News to write stories that the agency wanted published and to shape what millions of ordinary Americans believed about world events, foreign governments, and their own country. And this was not a conspiracy theory but a fully confirmed and documented government program that ran from the 1950s all the way through the 1970s. Reporters on the CIA payroll would plant stories, kill inconvenient articles, and funnel agency talking points directly into mainstream news while their editors either looked the other way or actively cooperated. The Church Committee confirmed it in 1975, and the American public largely forgot about it within a decade. 13. Dorothy Kilgallen was one of America's most famous journalists, a television personality, a sharp and relentless reporter, and the only journalist in the entire country who managed to privately interview Jack Ruby after he shot Lee Harvey Oswald. And then in November 1965, She turned up dead in her New York apartment from an alleged overdose, and every single document from her entire JFK assassination investigation had vanished from her home before the police even finished their report. People who knew Kilgallen said she had been telling close friends she was about to break the JFK case wide open. The medical examiner found an unusual combination of alcohol and barbiturates in her system. Her research notes, interview transcripts, and investigation files were never found, and the case was closed without serious inquiry. 14. In 1933, a group of extremely wealthy American businessmen, including executives connected to Morgan Bank and the DuPont family, allegedly approached retired Marine General Smedley Butler with a proposal to lead a private army of 500,000 veterans in a military coup to overthrow President Franklin Roosevelt and replace the American government with a fascist dictatorship modeled on what Mussolini was doing in Europe. And Butler's response was to go directly to Congress and blow the entire plot wide open. The House of Representatives actually investigated it, confirmed the plot was real, named names, and then did absolutely nothing. Not a single businessman was arrested, charged, or even publicly shamed in any meaningful way. The whole attempted coup against American democracy quietly disappeared from the history books. 15. In May 1939, a ship called the MS Saint. Louis left Germany carrying 937 Jewish refugees who were fleeing the Nazi regime with visas, paperwork, and desperate hope that America would let them in. And the United States government looked at that ship sitting off the coast of Florida, looked at those 937 human beings, and told them to turn around and go back to Europe, where at least 254 of them were eventually murdered in the Holocaust. And the State Department had already been warned internally about exactly what would happen to these people if they were refused entry. Coast Guard boats followed the ship to make sure nobody swam ashore. The refugees could literally see the lights of Miami from the deck. 16. Within hours of Nikola Tesla dying alone in his New York hotel room in January 1943, the United States government sent agents from the Office of Alien Property to his room and seized every single paper, notebook, file, and document he owned before his family, his colleagues, or anyone else could get anywhere near them. And the files related to his directed energy weapons research, the technology he called his most important invention, remain classified to this day with no public explanation for why the papers of a dead scientist need to be kept secret more than 80 years after his death. Tesla's nephew spent a full decade fighting through legal channels to recover even a portion of the documents and confirmed when he finally got access that entire sections had been permanently removed. 17. The 1904 St. Louis World's Fair was attended by 20 million Americans who came to see the rides, the food, the grand pavilions, and also apparently over 1,000 living human beings from the Philippines, Africa, and Native American communities who had been brought to the fairgrounds and placed in staged village displays so that white American visitors could walk past them, observe them, and feel scientifically confirmed in their belief that certain races were lower on the evolutionary ladder than others. Fair organizers called it anthropology. Attendees called it fascinating. One Filipino man named Ota Benga was later transferred to the Bronx Zoo and displayed in the primate enclosure. The fair was considered a magnificent success and a proud moment in American cultural history. 18. In 1950, the United States Navy sailed boats along the coast of San Francisco and spent an entire week spraying the city with biological agents, including a bacteria called Serratia marcescens, to test how a bioweapon would spread through a dense urban population. And the residents of San Francisco had absolutely no idea they were the test subjects breathing in whatever the Navy decided to release into their air that week. Shortly after the spraying, a cluster of patients at Stanford University Hospital came down with rare Serratia infections, and one man named Edward Nevins died. His family sued the government, lost, and the Navy never apologized. The program was part of a broader secret biological warfare testing initiative that ran for years across multiple American cities. 19. American doctors working for the United States Public Health Service traveled to Guatemala in the 1940s and deliberately infected prisoners, soldiers, and patients in psychiatric institutions with syphilis and gonorrhea without telling any of them what was being done to their bodies. And this program was funded entirely by American taxpayer money and personally approved by the Surgeon General of the United States. The researchers were specifically doing in Guatemala what they knew they could not legally do inside America. The study remained completely secret for over 60 years until a historian named Susan Reverby stumbled across the archived records in 2010. President Obama called Guatemala to personally apologize in 2010. Not a single researcher was ever prosecuted. 20. Tobacco company executives sat in a conference room in the 1950s, read their own internal research proving beyond any reasonable scientific doubt that cigarettes caused lung cancer, looked at each other, and made the collective decision to destroy the documents, hire scientists to publicly dispute the findings, and keep selling cigarettes to millions of Americans for 40 more years because the profits were too good to stop. The internal memos later recovered in litigation showed the industry knew everything, while their advertisements featured doctors endorsing cigarettes as a healthy choice, and their lobbyists attacked any scientist brave enough to publish the truth. By the time the full cover-up was exposed in the 1990s, hundreds of thousands of Americans had died from cancers the industry had privately confirmed were caused by their product decades earlier. 21. The U.S. The military dropped napalm on civilian villages in Korea years before Vietnam made it famous, and then quietly scrubbed most of the evidence from public records and school textbooks, so that generations of Americans grew up thinking napalm was a Vietnam invention, rather than a weapon their government had already tested extensively on Korean civilians a decade earlier. Military documents confirmed the widespread use, but the official narrative got cleaned up so thoroughly that most Americans today have genuinely never heard a single word about it. 22. Richard Nixon was so desperate to win the 1968 presidential election that he secretly sent back channel messages to South Vietnam, telling their government to walk away from peace talks with the promise he would give them a better deal after he won, deliberately extending a war that would kill thousands more American soldiers just so he could ride into the White House as a hero. Lyndon Johnson found out, called it treason on a recorded phone call, and then did absolutely nothing because exposing Nixon would have meant exposing how the U.S. had been secretly negotiating in the first place. 23. Rosewood was a thriving all-black town in Florida with homes, businesses, churches, and a functioning community until January 1923, when a white mob burned every single building to the ground, hunted residents through the woods, and massacred an unknown number of people while local law enforcement watched and the state of Florida did absolutely nothing for 70 years. Survivors fled into the swamps and never returned. The town was wiped off maps. Florida only acknowledged what happened and offered survivor compensation in 1994. 7 decades after the state watched an entire community get destroyed and decided it was not their problem. 24. In 1961, a United States Air Force B-52 broke apart over North Carolina and dropped 2 fully armed hydrogen bombs near the town of Goldsboro, and one of those bombs came within a single low-voltage switch failure of detonating a blast 260 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima directly over American soil. But 3 of the 4 safety mechanisms had already failed on the way down. The Air Force denied the severity of the incident for decades until a declassified document in 2013 confirmed that the United States almost accidentally nuked North Carolina, and nobody in charge ever publicly said sorry. 25. A 2011 partial audit of the Federal Reserve revealed that during the 2008 financial crisis, the Fed secretly loaned $16 trillion to banks around the world without any congressional approval, without any public announcement, and without telling the American people that their central bank was quietly handing out money at a scale larger than the entire U.S. economy, including over $3 trillion that went to foreign banks in Europe. Senator Bernie Sanders pushed for the audit, and the results were buried so effectively in financial news coverage that most Americans heard nothing about the largest secret bank bailout in human history. 26. After 9/11, the American Psychological Association's leadership worked directly with CIA and Pentagon officials to help design and justify the torture techniques being used on detainees in U.S. our custody, and then spent years publicly insisting the organization had done no such thing until a completely independent investigation in 2015 produced internal emails proving the cover-up was deliberate, coordinated, and approved at the highest levels of the organization. Psychologists who had raised ethical objections internally were sidelined and ignored. The APA issued an apology, changed some policies, and the officials most responsible faced no criminal consequences whatsoever. I-27. In July 1944, an ammunition explosion at Port Chicago Naval Magazine in California killed 320 men, the majority of them black sailors who had been assigned the most dangerous loading work while white officers supervised from a safe distance. And when 258 black sailors refused to return to those same deadly conditions without safety improvements, the Navy charged 50 of them with mutiny, held a rush trial, and convicted them all, while the white officers who had created the unsafe conditions faced absolutely no consequences, in what historians have since called one of the most racially motivated military prosecutions in American history. 28. The NSA was secretly collecting the metadata of virtually every single phone call made by American citizens from 2001 all the way through 2013, and senior government officials, including the Director of National Intelligence James Clapper, went before Congress and stated under oath that no such program existed, which was a lie. And the only reason Americans found out the truth was because a contractor named Edward Snowden copied the files and handed them to journalists in 2013. A federal court later ruled the mass surveillance program was illegal. Clapper was never charged with perjury. Snowden was charged with espionage and fled to Russia. 29. The FBI informant who helped the Bureau plan its 1969 raid on Black Panther leader Fred Hampton's apartment provided agents with a detailed floor plan of the home marking exactly where Hampton slept. And in the pre-dawn raid that followed, Hampton was shot 14 times while still in his bed, eyed with forensic evidence strongly suggesting he was drugged beforehand and never even woke up. Internal FBI memos recovered later showed agency officials writing congratulatory notes to each other, celebrating Hampton's death. Hampton was 21 years old. No federal agent was ever charged, and a civil lawsuit settlement was paid out years later with no admission of wrongdoing. 30. The CIA overthrew Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953. In a coup the agency later described in its own declassified internal history as a direct act of American foreign policy, carried out primarily to protect British petroleum interests after Mossadegh had the audacity to suggest that Iranian oil should belong to the people of Iran, rather than a British company. The CIA hired street thugs, bribed Iranian military officers, and staged fake communist riots to manufacture a crisis that justified removing him. The agency installed a Shah, who ruled through a brutal secret police force for 26 years, and the blowback from that one decision shaped the entire modern Middle East. 31. Over 1 million people were deported during Operation Wetback in 1954, including an unknown number of actual American citizens who were swept up in mass roundups that offered no hearings, no lawyers, no due process, and no real system for distinguishing legal residents from undocumented ones, because the operation was designed for speed and optics rather than accuracy. People were loaded onto buses and planes and dumped across the border, sometimes in locations hundreds of miles from where they actually lived. The operation was celebrated as a law enforcement success, and the official name was used proudly in government press releases without anyone apparently finding it problematic. 32. Philo Farnsworth was a teenage farm boy from Idaho who invented television at age 21, held the patents, proved it worked, and then spent the rest of his life watching RCA steal his technology, bury his patents in litigation, and rewrite the official history of television to credit their own executive David Sarnoff instead, so thoroughly that most Americans today have never once heard the name of the man who actually invented the device they watch every single day. Farnsworth's patents expired before he could profit from them. He died bitter and nearly broke while RCA made billions. He once refused to let his own children watch TV because he felt it was being used for garbage. 33. The CIA's MKUltra program ran secret LSD experiments on Americans who had no idea they were being dosed, including a government scientist named Frank Olson, who was slipped LSD without his knowledge during a work retreat, and 9 days later fell from a New York hotel window in what was ruled a suicide. except that when his body was exhumed in 1994, an independent forensic examination found skull fractures that were inconsistent with a fall, and more consistent with someone being knocked unconscious before going through the window. The CIA destroyed most MK-Ultra documents in 1973 before investigators could read them, and no one was ever charged with anything. 34. From 1954 to 1973, the U.S. Army ran a program called Operation Whitecoat, in which they recruited Seventh-day Adventist soldiers who were conscientious objectors, told them they could serve their country without carrying weapons, and then used them as voluntary human test subjects for biological weapons research, including exposure to diseases like Q fever, yellow fever, and Venezuelan equine encephalitis to study how quickly the infection spread and how badly they incapacitated healthy young men. The soldiers were told the research was defensive in nature. Whether they were given complete information about the risks they were accepting remains a genuinely open question that the Army has never fully answered. To 35. DuPont spent decades knowingly dumping PFAS chemicals called forever chemicals into drinking water sources across America while sitting on internal research from as early as the 1960s confirming these chemicals caused cancer, birth defects, and organ damage. And they kept doing it because the chemicals were enormously profitable and cleaning them up would have cost more than paying out whatever lawsuits eventually came. Which is a calculation that American corporations have made so many times it barely registers as news anymore. PFAS chemicals are now detectable in the blood of virtually every American alive, including newborn babies, and the EPA only began seriously regulating them decades after DuPont knew exactly what they were doing. 36. During the Gulf War, the U.S. military used plows mounted on tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles to bury thousands of Iraqi soldiers alive in their trenches, pushing sand over them while some were still shooting and others were attempting to surrender. And Pentagon officials later confirmed this happened and described it as a legitimate battlefield tactic, while the mainstream American media gave the story almost no coverage because the Gulf War had very carefully managed press access designed specifically to prevent Americans from seeing the uglier parts of what was being done in their name in the Iraqi desert. 37. The CIA admitted in 1998 that throughout the 1980s they knew that Nicaraguan Contra rebels were smuggling cocaine into the United States, that this drug money was helping fund their operations, and that the agency had deliberately looked the other way because the Contras were their guys, and the Cold War mission mattered more than the crack epidemic that was simultaneously destroying black communities in Los Angeles and other American cities. Journalist Gary Webb broke the story in 1996, had his career systematically destroyed by establishment media outlets that mocked his reporting, and was found dead of 2 gunshot wounds to the head in 2004 in a death ruled a suicide. 38. Medical schools across America in the 19th century had such a serious shortage of cadavers for anatomy classes that grave robbing became a standard unofficial industry, and black cemeteries were specifically and disproportionately targeted because grave robbers correctly calculated that complaints from black families would receive less attention from law enforcement and less outrage from white communities. Making black graves effectively the path of least resistance for body snatchers, supplying both northern and southern medical schools in what historians have described as a widespread open secret among medical educators who simply never asked where the bodies were coming from. 39. The Pentagon has $21 trillion in undocumented accounting adjustments logged between 1998 and 2015, a figure that is larger than the entire gross domestic product of the United States. Confirmed by a federally mandated audit that the Department of Defense failed, and this information was reported, verified, and then received so little mainstream media coverage that the vast majority of Americans have never heard a single number from what is arguably the largest accounting scandal in the history of any government on the planet. The Pentagon has never passed a complete audit. Congress keeps funding them anyway without serious consequence or demand for explanation. 40. By 1900, Standard Oil had secretly purchased and was quietly operating dozens of companies that were supposed to be its direct competitors, creating the illusion of a free market in American oil, while John D. Rockefeller controlled virtually the entire industry from a single boardroom. And this scheme only came to light buried deep inside antitrust case evidence, because Standard Oil was so good at hiding ownership structures that investigators had to dig through layers of shell companies and proxy shareholders before they could prove what everyone in the industry already quietly understood, which was that American capitalism's most celebrated success story was running a monopoly disguised as a competitive marketplace the entire time. 41. The radium girls were young factory workers in the 1920s, hired to paint watch dials with glowing radium paint, and their supervisors told them the paint was completely safe, even encouraging them to point their brushes with their lips to get a finer tip, while company executives were already privately receiving medical reports confirming that radium was destroying workers from the inside out. Girls' jaws literally crumbled, teeth fell out, bones fractured spontaneously. The company's response was to hire doctors to tell sick workers they were imagining their symptoms. 42. In 1966, a U.S. Air Force plane collided over southern Spain and dropped 4 hydrogen bombs near the small village of Palomares. And while American cleanup crews arrived in full hazmat suits collecting contaminated soil, Spanish residents were told by officials there was absolutely no danger, no radiation, no reason for concern, and they should continue farming their fields and going about their normal lives directly next to one of the worst nuclear contamination sites in European history. One bomb fell into the Mediterranean and took 3 months to recover. Spain is still waiting for full American cleanup assistance. 43. During the Cold War, the State Department secretly funded American abstract expressionist painters like Jackson Pollock and used their work as cultural propaganda to prove to the world that America was a free creative society, unlike the Soviet Union. All without telling the artists themselves that their paintings were being shipped around Europe as government-sponsored psychological warfare material. The artists had no idea their canvases were CIA-adjacent diplomatic tools. Pollock reportedly would have been furious. The program ran for years, and the art world only found out decades later when declassified documents surfaced. 44. The Church Committee in 1975 confirmed that the CIA had developed working poison dart guns that could fire an undetectable frozen dart into a human target. Shellfish toxin capsules small enough to hide in clothing, and exploding cigars, all specifically designed for assassinating foreign leaders. And the agency had active plots against at least 8 heads of state, including Fidel Castro, who survived so many CIA attempts on his life that he reportedly joked about it openly. The committee confirmed all of this in open congressional hearings, and most Americans forgot about it within a single news cycle. 45. The United States government actively supported the 1964 military coup that overthrew Brazil's democratically elected President João Goulart, and declassified documents later confirmed that President Johnson had American naval forces pre-positioned off the Brazilian coast, ready to provide direct military support before the coup was even finished, meaning the U.S. was not merely watching events unfold, but was a fully committed partner in dismantling South American democracy to prevent a left-leaning government from existing in the Western Hemisphere during the Cold War. Brazil's military dictatorship that followed lasted 21 years. 46. The federal government's own Senate investigation in the 2000s found that the Department of Health and Human Services had been handing unaccompanied migrant children directly to labor traffickers without conducting basic background checks on the adults claiming them, meaning the agency tasked with protecting vulnerable children was functionally operating as a delivery service for people who wanted to exploit them on farms, in factories, and in private homes across America. Some of the investigation confirmed this was not isolated but systematic. The officials responsible were not fired, and the story received a fraction of the coverage it deserved. 47. The DEA emergency scheduled MDMA as a Schedule I drug in 1985, making it illegal for any purpose, including medical research. And they did this specifically overriding their own administrative law judge, who had reviewed all available scientific evidence and formally concluded the emergency ban was not scientifically justified and recommended keeping MDMA available for therapeutic use. A recommendation the DEA simply ignored because scheduling decisions are ultimately political rather than scientific, and the war on drugs needed new entries on its list regardless of what the evidence actually said about therapeutic potential. 48. Walt Disney was an active FBI informant who personally appeared before the House Un-American Activities Committee and named fellow artists and animators as suspected communists, helping to destroy careers across Hollywood. And the people he helped blacklist included workers from his own studio who had organized a strike against him in 1941, meaning Disney used the machinery of government political persecution partly as personal revenge against employees who had dared to demand better wages and working conditions from the man whose wholesome family entertainment empire was built substantially on their creative labor. 49. During Prohibition, the United States government ordered the deliberate poisoning of industrial alcohol with toxic chemicals, including methanol, benzene, and chloroform specifically to deter people from drinking it. And when Americans kept drinking it anyway and started dying, the government did not stop the program, but instead increased the poison concentrations, resulting in an estimated 10,000 American deaths that were not accidents or tragedies, but the direct and documented result of official federal policy targeting its own citizens for choosing to consume a substance the government had decided they were not allowed to have. 50. The FBI's COINTELPRO program was a fully authorized domestic operation that forged letters to destroy civil rights leaders' marriages, sent anonymous death threats to activists, planted fake evidence to frame innocent people, and in at least one documented case mailed a letter to Martin Luther King encouraging him to commit suicide. All personally sanctioned by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who considered the civil rights movement a greater threat to America than organized crime, foreign spies, or actual domestic terrorists operating openly in the South during the same period. 51. So Coca-Cola owned a bottling company in Guatemala during the 1970s and 1980s, where union organizers were being systematically kidnapped and murdered, and the corporate headquarters in Atlanta was receiving detailed reports about exactly what was happening to workers who tried to organize. Meaning the company that sells happiness and polar bears in Christmas commercials had full knowledge that people were being killed at their facility. And the primary corporate response was to continue operations and deny responsibility until international boycott pressure finally became too expensive to ignore. 52. In 1967, Israeli military forces attacked the USS Liberty, an American Navy intelligence ship sailing in international waters, for 2 full hours with fighter jets and torpedo boats, killing 34 American sailors and wounding over 170 more. And the United States government's response was to immediately classify the incident, order survivors to never speak about it publicly under threat of court-martial, and quietly accept Israel's explanation that the whole thing was a case of mistaken identity, despite survivors insisting the ship was clearly marked and the attack was deliberate and sustained. 53. The Bank of Credit and Commerce International, known as BCCI, was a Pakistani-founded global bank that simultaneously laundered money for the CIA, Colombian drug cartels, Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega, and various terrorist organizations for decades, and when it finally collapsed in 1991 in the largest bank fraud in history. Up to that point, every American official who had known about its criminal operations and looked the other way walked away completely uncharged, while ordinary depositors around the world lost their savings, and the full story of what BCCI financed was quietly buried. 54J. Marion Sims is celebrated in medical textbooks as the father of modern gynecology and has statues erected in his honor. But the surgical techniques that made him famous were developed throughout the 1840s by operating repeatedly on enslaved black women without anesthesia, with Sims arguing publicly that black people did not experience pain the same way white people did, a claim he invented to justify what he was doing rather than a conclusion he had reached through any legitimate scientific process. And those women's names were almost entirely erased from the history of the medicine their suffering created. 55. The United States Army ran a classified program in the 1980s at Fort Bragg called Project Jedi, in which an official military colonel conducted serious funded experiments attempting to kill goats by staring at them with focused mental energy, or believing that psychic warfare techniques could be developed into legitimate battlefield weapons. And this was not a fringe operation run by one eccentric officer, but a sanctioned program with real budget allocation based on the military's genuine interest in whether human beings could be trained to stop hearts, walk through walls, or become invisible using only the power of concentrated thought. 56. Wells Fargo and several other major American banks were proven in federal court through their own internal emails to have deliberately steered Black and Hispanic homeowners into expensive predatory subprime mortgage loans, even when those customers fully qualified for cheaper conventional loans. Meaning bank employees were not making mistakes or misjudging applications, but were consciously targeting minority borrowers for worse financial products, because those products generated higher fees, and the banks had correctly calculated that the regulatory consequences would cost less than the profits they were extracting from communities they had spent decades systematically underserving. 57. So veterans who were exposed to Agent Orange during the Vietnam War spent decades being denied disability benefits, while the VA deliberately constructed an almost impossibly high scientific causation standard specifically designed to make it nearly impossible for veterans to prove their cancers, nerve damage, and birth defect causing exposures were connected to the herbicide the military had sprayed across Southeast Asia, in quantities large enough to permanently alter the ecosystem. And the government that sent those men into chemically saturated jungles spent 30 years using bureaucratic fine print to avoid paying for what it had done to their bodies. 58. The Centralia, Pennsylvania mine fire has been burning underground since 1962, when a trash fire ignited an exposed coal seam, and the government eventually demolished the entire town and forcibly relocated residents. But internal documents later suggested the aggressive eviction campaign was motivated at least partly by a desire to eliminate the legal liability of allowing people to keep living above an ongoing environmental disaster rather than purely by concern for the safety of the 12. 100 people whose homes, churches, and entire community were demolished and replaced with empty streets that still sit above a fire burning to this day. 59. DARPA announced the cancellation of its LifeLog project on February 4, 2004, a program designed to create a permanent searchable digital record of everything a person did, said, read, and experienced throughout their entire life. And that cancellation happened on the exact same calendar day that Mark Zuckerberg launched Facebook from his Harvard dorm room, a coincidence the Pentagon has never addressed, never explained, and never commented on, despite the fact that the product a private company built and sold to billions of people is functionally identical to what the Defense Department said it was abandoning that same morning. 60. Congressman Larry McDonald was one of the most prominent and vocal anti-communist politicians in America, and he happened to be aboard Korean Air Flight 007 when Soviet jets shot it down over restricted airspace in 1983, killing all 269 people on board. And while the official explanation was that the Soviets mistook it for a spy plane, declassified records raised uncomfortable questions about whether American military tracking systems had real-time awareness of the civilian plane's location, and why that information was apparently never used to warn the aircraft before it was destroyed. 61. The FBI deployed over 2,000 paid informants on American college campuses during the 1960s and 1970s to infiltrate student organizations, and many of those informants were not just watching and reporting, but were actively paid to provoke students into committing illegal acts so that the FBI would have justification to make mass arrests and destroy political movements that J. Edgar Hoover personally found threatening. Meaning the federal government was essentially manufacturing the crimes it was simultaneously prosecuting while presenting itself to the American public as a neutral law enforcement agency protecting democracy. 62. Thousands of Haitian refugees fleeing political violence were detained at Guantanamo Bay in the early 1990s, and those who tested positive for HIV were held in a separate camp that a federal judge formally ruled constituted cruel and inhumane treatment, describing conditions that were worse than what the nearby military prison population was experiencing. And these were not criminals or combatants, but desperate people who had survived dangerous ocean crossings seeking asylum and were rewarded with indefinite detention in open-air camps while American immigration officials decided what to do with people nobody in Washington wanted to talk about. 63. Standard Oil, General Motors, and Firestone Tire were convicted in federal court in 1949 of conspiring to purchase and systematically dismantle electric streetcar systems across dozens of major American cities during the 1930s and 1940s, replacing functional public transit with buses that required gasoline, And the total fine the court imposed for this coordinated destruction of urban infrastructure that shaped American car dependency for the next century was $5,000, which General Motors paid without comment and which represented approximately 0% of the profits the conspiracy had generated for everyone involved. 64. The Oneida community in 19th century upstate New York was a religious commune where founder John Humphrey Noyes personally controlled who was allowed to reproduce with whom, as part of a selective human breeding program he called stirpiculture, in assigning reproduction partners based on his assessment of their spiritual and physical qualities, fathering dozens of children himself through this system. And the commune eventually dissolved, but its members reorganized as a business, and the Oneida Silverware Company that still exists today, and whose products sit in ordinary American kitchen drawers, descended directly from a 19th century human breeding experiment. 65. In 1921, the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, was the wealthiest black community in America, packed with black-owned businesses, hotels, law offices, and theaters, and a white mob burned all of it to the ground over 2 days while some attackers fired weapons from private airplanes overhead in what remains the only domestic aerial assault on American civilians in United States history, killing an estimated 300 people and leaving 10,000 black residents homeless, while the Oklahoma government responded by attempting to charge the survivors with inciting the riot that had just destroyed everything they owned. 66. After World War II, the United States government secretly recruited over 1,600 Nazi scientists, engineers, and intelligence officers and relocated them into American society under Operation Paperclip, scrubbing or falsifying their war records so they could obtain security clearances, with some going on to hold senior positions at NASA and major American defense contractors, meaning the space program that made Americans feel proudest about their nation's ingenuity was partially built by men whose previous employer had been the Third Reich, and whose earlier work had involved concentration camp labor and horrific human experimentation. 67. Ford's internal engineers calculated in the early 1970s that fixing a known fuel tank defect in the Pinto that caused the car to explode in rear-end collisions would cost $11 per vehicle. And Ford executives produced an internal memo explicitly comparing that repair cost against the projected cost of paying out wrongful death lawsuits, and concluded it was cheaper to let people burn to death than fix the tank, then approved continued production of the car. And that memo later became one of the most notorious documents in American corporate history when it surfaced in court. 68. Saw declassified documents confirmed that the Truman administration knew after World War II that American prisoners of war were being held in Soviet labor camps rather than repatriated, and made a deliberate political decision not to confront Stalin about it, because Cold War diplomatic relations were considered more valuable than the lives of the American servicemen the government had left behind. And the families of those men spent years being told officially that their loved ones were dead or unaccounted for, while government officials privately knew exactly where at least some of them were and chose to do nothing.
69. The classified documents confirmed that the Truman administration knew after World War II that American prisoners of war were being held in Soviet labor camps rather than repatriated, and made a deliberate political decision not to confront Stalin about it because Cold War. Diplomatic relations were considered more valuable than the lives of the American servicemen government had left behind, and the families of those men spent years being told officially that their loved ones were dead or unaccounted for, while government officials privately knew exactly where at least some were and chose to do nothing. Henry Kissinger personally authorized the assassination of Chilean Army Commander Rene Schneider in 1970 because Schneider had refused to support a military coup against democratic Yell. With Salvador Allende and Kissinger wanting him removed, and the authorization for this murder was not a rumor or an allegation, but was confirmed by Kissinger's own handwritten notes on planning documents that were declassified and published, showing the National Security Advisor of the United States approving the killing of a foreigner general whose only offense was believing that democratic elections should be respected in his own country.
70.
Bracero program brought 4.6 million Mexican workers into the United States between 1942 and 1960 for under contracts that promised fair wages and the U.S. government deducted 10% of every worker as pay into a savings fund that was supposed to be returned to them when they went home. And then the money simply vanished, absorbed somewhere between the U.S. Treasury and Mexican banks. And the workers who had bent their backs harvesting American crops for decades never received a single dollar of it, despite decades of lawsuits, investigations, and diplomatic complaints.
That produced
almost nothing. 71. J. Edgar Hoover ran the FBI for 48 years and spent most of that time building secret personal blackmail files on every American president, senator, and public figure he could gather dirt on, using that information to make himself untouchable and unfireable regardless of who was in the White House. And when he finally died in 1970 through his personal secretary, Helen Gandy spent days systematically destroying his private files before Congress could subpoena them. Meaning the most powerful and elected official in American history took most of his secrets directly into the shredder.
72.
American sugar plantation owners in Hawaii hired U.S. Marines in 1893 to surround the royal palace while their business associates walked inside and told Queen Liliuokalani she was no longer in charge executing a corporate coup against a sovereign nation while the Marines stood outside with weapons ensuring she could not call for help. And the sugar lobby then literally wrote the annexation proposal that was submitted to Congress, making the acquisition of Hawaii one of the most transparently commercial land grabs in American history, dressed up in the language of manifest destiny and democratic progress.
73.
Up to 250,000 Gulf War veterans came home with a mysterious cluster of symptoms including chronic fatigue, neurological damage, and organ problems that became known as Gulf War Syndrome, and the U.S. government spent 30 years denying it was a real condition connected to their service, funding studies specifically designed to produce inconclusive results, and stonewalling disability claims while veterans deteriorated, and when the government finally acknowledged the connection, it did so quietly with no press conference, no national apology, and no serious accountability for 3 decades of deliberate denial that left sick veterans without support.
74.
When the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant began melting down in Pennsylvania in 1979, local emergency management officials were supposed to have a practiced evacuation plan ready to execute. He and investigators discovered afterward that the sealed envelope containing that emergency plan had never once been opened, meaning the people responsible for protecting hundreds of thousands of residents from a nuclear disaster had received their emergency procedures placed them in a drawer, and never read a single page of them before the morning an actual nuclear meltdown began unfolding, -1 miles from the state capitol.
75.
The U.S. military ran a program during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars creating hundreds of fake Arabic language social media personas operated by American service members to flood online spaces with pro-American messaging and shape how ordinary Middle Eastern civilians thought about the wars being fought in their countries. A large-scale military deception operation confirmed by a Guardian investigation in 2011 that received minimal American media coverage because the idea of the U.S. government running industrial-scale social media manipulation was apparently less newsworthy than whatever else was happening in American politics that particular week.
76.
George D. Morenchel was a Texas oil geologist, a man of curious international connections, and the closest known friend of Lee Harvey Oswald in the months before the Kennedy assassination. And on the precise morning in March 1977 that a House Assassination Committee investigator arrived at his Florida home to finally interview him about what he knew. D. Morenchel was found dead from a gunshot wound ruled a suicide, making him one of a genuinely remarkable number of people connected to the Kennedy assassination who died in convenient proximity to moments when investigators were closing in. 77. The Citizens United Supreme Court decision that reshaped American campaign finance forever began as a minor complaint about a political documentary, but internal documents and legal analyses revealed that conservative justices pushed to dramatically expand the case far beyond what any of the lawyers had actually argued, essentially rewriting American constitutional law around campaign finance on their own initiative to reach a sweeping conclusion that transformed corporations into political speakers with unlimited spending rights, a legal revolution that none of the original parties had requested and that fundamentally altered who controls American elections.
78.
The Indian Adoption Project ran from 1958 to 1967 as a federal program that systematically removed Native American children from their families and placed them with white families across America. That's America,
with
internal government memos explicitly describing the forced assimilation as a bureaucratic solution to what officials call the Indian problem. And by the program's end, 35% of all Native American children have been separated from their families and their cultures, the highest removal rate of any ethnic group. In American history, in a program that met the legal definition of cultural genocide under international law.
79.
After the 1989 Cold Fusion announcement caused a brief explosion of scientific excitement in the U.S., military quietly classified follow-up research and federal funding agencies began sending informal messages to university labs indicating that continued federal support would be reviewed if positive cold fusion results were published, effectively using financial pressure to suppress scientific inquiry into an energy technology that, if real, would have been worth trillions of dollars and made certain existing energy industries completely obsolete, which may or may not explain why the research suppression was so swift, so quiet, and so thoroughly effective. 80. Minstrel shows featuring white performers in blackface. Mocking black Americans were not a fringe or regional entertainment, but the single most popular form of mass entertainment in the United States for nearly 100 years, performed in northern cities in the American South, and multiple times at the White House itself for sitting presidents. Embedded so deeply into American cultural life that the last professional minstrel troupe did not formally disband until 1978, meaning this form of entertainment outlasted the moon landing, the Civil Rights Act, and the desegregation of American schools before anyone officially decided it was time to stop. 81. In 1985, the Philadelphia Police Department dropped a bomb on a row house in a residential neighborhood to dislodge a black liberation group called Move, igniting a fire that burned 61 homes to the ground and killed 11 people, including 5 children. Firefighters were ordered to let the blaze spread, and when the smoke cleared and reporters asked Philadelphia Mayor Wilson Goode if he had any regrets about bombing his own city and killing children, he looked into the cameras and said he would make the same decision again. 82. During the 1918 flu pandemic that would eventually kill 50 million people worldwide, the United States government ordered newspapers to stop reporting death tolls and suppress coverage of how badly the virus was spreading because World War I was still happening and officials decided that civilian morale for the war effort was more important than giving Americans accurate information about a disease that was killing their neighbors, their soldiers, and their families. And historians have since argued that this deliberate information blackout prevented people from taking protective measures and directly accelerated the deaths of
83.
83. After Ralph Nader published his book exposing deadly safety defects in the General Motors Covert, GM hired private investigators to dig through his personal life looking for affairs, financial scandals, or anything embarrassing enough to destroy his credibility and discredit his safety research. And when this surveillance operation was discovered and exposed, the president of General Motors was hauled before the United States Senate to personally apologize to Nader. In one of the most publicly humiliating corporate moments in American history, which Nader used as a platform to become even more famous and effective than he already was. 84. Declassified State Department cables confirmed that the United States provided Iraq with detailed satellite battlefield intelligence during the 1980s Iran-Iraq War with full knowledge that Saddam Hussein's military was using that information to coordinate chemical weapons attacks on Iranian soldiers and Kurdish civilians, meaning American officials, were not accidentally enabling war crimes, but were consciously feeding targeting data into a military operation they knew was deploying mustard gas and nerve agents against human beings, then publicly maintaining that the United States had no involvement in Iraqi chemical weapons use. 85. Jack Ruby sat in a Dallas jail after shooting Lee Harvey Oswald and repeatedly told investigators and journalists that he could not tell the truth about what he knew while he was in Dallas, and desperately begged the Warren Commission to transport him to Washington, where he claimed he could speak freely and safely. And the Warren Commission denied his request, decided his testimony in Dallas was sufficient, and Ruby died in prison of cancer in 1967, having never been given the opportunity to say whatever it was he believed was too dangerous to say in Texas.
86.
86. Black veterans who came home after fighting for America in World War II found that the G bill, which promised low-cost mortgages, college tuition, and business loans applied to everyone except them in practice, with banks refusing to process their mortgage applications, universities rejecting their enrollment requests, and the federal government declining to enforce their legal rights. Meaning the legislation that built the American middle class and is celebrated as one of the most generous veteran benefit programs in history was systematically administered in a way that excluded the black men who had risked their lives to earn it.
87. A second American military plane dropped armed hydrogen bombs over American soil in 1961. On this time near Goldsboro, North Carolina, in a separate incident from the earlier Faro drop. And the Air Force denied the severity of this accident for decades until a declassified document surfaced in 2013, confirming that safety mechanisms had failed. Then the bomb came extremely close to detonating over an American city, meaning the United States Air Force accidentally nearly nuked its own territory twice within the same year and successfully kept both incidents from the American public for over 50 years.
88. In 1933, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6100 forcing every American citizen to surrender their privately held gold to the Federal Reserve at a government-mandated price of $20 and 67 cents per ounce under threat of 10 years imprisonment and immediately after. Collecting all that gold, that government revalued it to $35 per ounce, pocketing the enormous difference between what they paid citizens and what the gold was actually worth and what was functionally a massive hidden wealth transfer from ordinary Americans to the federal government that textbooks rarely describe in those particular term. 89. Walter Freeman was not a trained surgeon, held no surgical license, and drove a vehicle he called the Lobotomobile across America, performing over 3,400 lobotomies by hammering an ice pick through patients' eye sockets and wiggling it around to sever brain connections. Operating on men, women, and children in clinic parking lots and hotel rooms while medical establishments looked the other way because lobotomy was considered a legitimate psychiatric treatment. And Freeman was considered a pioneer rather than what he almost certainly was, which was a man, causing catastrophic brain damage to thousands of vulnerable people without meaningful oversight.
90.
The night before the Challenger space shuttle launched in January 1986, engineers from Morton Thiokol sent written warnings to NASA managers specifically stating that the O-ring seals would fail in the cold temperatures forecast for launch morning and recommending the launch be delayed. And NASA managers overruled the engineers launched anyway, and 73 seconds later, seven astronauts were dead. After which NASA's internal response focused substantially on managing the public relations crisis rather than immediately acknowledging that written safety warnings from their own engineers had been consciously set aside the night before 7 people died. 91. Project Chaos was a CIA domestic surveillance program that compiled secret files on 300,000 ordinary American citizens, including students, journalists, and anti-war activists, between 1967 and 1974, which was entirely illegal because the CIA is explicitly prohibited from conducting domestic operations. And the program only came to light during the Church Committee investigations, after which the agency promised it would never happen again. A promise that subsequent decades of surveillance revelations have done absolutely nothing to make more believable to anyone paying even minimal attention. 92. Marilyn Monroe had a 51-page FBI surveillance file built on years of active monitoring and the wiretap recordings from the final hours before she died in August 1962 have never been released to the public despite decades of freedom of information requests, meaning the government that was secretly listening to one of the most famous women in America on the night she died has spent 60 years deciding that whatever those recordings contain is still somehow too sensitive for ordinary Americans to hear, which is a strange position to maintain about a case officially ruled an accidental overdose. 93. The 1876 presidential election was decided not by voters, but in a secret backroom negotiation where Republican Rutherford Hayes agreed to completely withdraw federal troops from the South and abandon the constitutional protections that Reconstruction had established for Black Americans
in exchange for
enough electoral votes to claim the White House. A deal that handed the presidency to a man who lost the popular vote and simultaneously stripped an entire population of their civil rights for the next 90 years. In what historians now call the Compromise of 1877, and what affected communities might reasonably call something 94. State Department officials had been internally warned before the MS St. Louis arrived off the Florida coast in 1939 that turning away its 937 Jewish passengers would likely result in many of them dying in Nazi-controlled Europe. Meaning the decision to refuse them entry was not made in ignorance, but with documented advance. Knowledge of the probable consequences. And at least 254 of those passengers were subsequently murdered in the Holocaust after being forced to return to the continent the American government had been warned. They could not safely return to 95. Tesla's nephew Sava Kasanovic fought through American legal channels for 10 years after the government seized his uncle's papers in 1943, trying to recover the research files, and when he finally gained partial access, he confirmed that entire sections of the documents had been permanently removed and withheld, meaning whoever processed Tesla's research after his death did not merely take custody of the papers temporarily, but made deliberate decisions about which portions of a dead inventor as worthless. Public would never be allowed to see. The 96. The state of California spent over $1.5 million between 1850 and 1860, reimbursing settlers for Native American scalps collected under official state bounty programs that paid cash for the physical proof that indigenous people had been killed making California one of several American states that used direct government financing to fund the systematic slaughter of native populations of programs so thoroughly buried in gold rush-era history. More than 60,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized under state eugenics laws that targeted people deemed unfit to reproduce, including the poor, the mentally ill, the disabled, immigrants. And these programs continued operating in American states until the 1970s, meaning that government-forced sterilization of American citizens was not a historical aberration, but an active ongoing policy within the living memory of millions of people alive in America. Today,
the Bureau of Indian Affairs ran a network of boarding schools that forcibly separated over 100,000 Native American children from their families with the stated official goal of killing the Indian and saving the man, meaning the explicit purpose was cultural annihilation, and children who were caught speaking their native languages were beaten, had their mouths washed out with soap, or faced other physical punishments designed to make them associate their own heritage with pain. In a generational trauma program the United States government funded, administered, and defended as humanitarian policy for nearly a century. Purdue Pharma's own internal sales tracking data showed clear evidence by 1997 that OxyContin was being widely diverted and abused across America, and rather than reporting this to regulators or reformulating the drug, the company's response was to use that abuse data as a market research tool to identify which communities had the highest rates of misuse, and then send additional sales representatives into those exact communities to sell more pills, turning the evidence of an emerging addiction catastrophe into a targeting map for expanding the market that was causing the catastrophe in the first place.
100. The My Lai massacre in Vietnam involved American soldiers killing hundreds of unarmed civilians, including women, children, and elderly people, but the full scope of what happened across multiple villages and involving far more soldiers than the single incident that became public was deliberately contained by military investigators who buried evidence, pressured witnesses, and ensured that Lieutenant William Kelly became the singular face of something that was significantly more widespread. And Kelly's eventual sentence of life imprisonment was quietly commuted to house arrest after 3.5 years by President Nixon following a public campaign portraying him as a scapegoat. 101. Reagan's 1980 presidential campaign allegedly sent secret back-channel negotiators to Tehran to convince Iran to hold the 52 American hostages until after Election Day. That Jimmy Carter could not claim a pre-election victory that might save his presidency. And this was not confirmed rumor for decades until a former Iranian official publicly corroborated the deal in 2023. Meaning the hostages who spent for 144 days in captivity may have had their suffering deliberately extended by the campaign of the man who won the election their captivity helped decide. 102. California prison officials performed forced sterilizations on incarcerated women without proper legal consent, well into the 2010s with a state audit confirming at least 148. Illegal procedures between 2006 and 2010, meaning government forced sterilization of American women was not a dark historical chapter from the eugenics era, but an active documented practice happening inside California state facilities. During the same decade that smartphones became mainstream reality television dominated America. Culture and the state was simultaneously presenting itself as the most progressive government in the country. The country, 103. In the fall of 1961, residents of a small California coastal town were dive-bombed by flocks of deranged seabirds that crashed into buildings, attacked people in the streets, and dropped dead fish across the neighborhood in an incident so bizarre that it made national news and was dismissed as an unexplained natural anomaly for 50 years, until researchers confirmed the birds had eaten anchovies loaded with toxic domoic acid that caused disorientation and seizures. And Alfred Hitchcock, who lived nearby, read the newspaper reports and used the real incident as direct inspiration for making the birds.
104.
Enron executives, including Kenneth Lay and Jeffrey Skilling, spent the final months before the company as 2001 collapsed quietly selling their own personal stock holdings, while simultaneously freezing the employee retirement accounts that held company stock, trapping ordinary workers inside a burning building financially, while the people who knew exactly what was happening walked calmly out the exit with their personal wealth intact. And internal memos recovered during litigation confirmed this was a deliberate, coordinated strategy rather than an administrative coincidence, after which Skilling received a prison sentence, and Lay died before serving his.
105.
The U.S. Army administered the experimental anti-malarial drug methylquine to soldiers in Panama without clearly disclosing that the drug was known to cause psychosis, paranoia, violent behavior, and suicidal ideation in a significant percentage of users. And when soldiers came back exhibiting exactly those symptoms, the military spent for decades denying any pharmaceutical connection to the psychiatric breakdowns, leaving veterans without proper diagnosis or treatment, while the Army protected a drug program, rather than acknowledge that they had chemically induced mental illness in the soldiers they were supposed to be protecting.
106.
106. The 3 Mile Island nuclear meltdown in 1979 released significantly more radiation into surrounding Pennsylvania communities than the Nuclear Regulatory Commission publicly admitted. An internal NRC studies examining cancer rates in communities downwind of the plant showed statistical spikes that agency officials quietly buried rather than publish, meaning the government body responsible for assuring Americans that nuclear power was being safely managed was simultaneously suppressing its own evidence, suggesting that the accident had caused exactly the kind of public health damage the agency had publicly insisted was impossible given the amount of radiation it claimed had been released.
107.
The Pentagon Papers revealed that analysts inside the United States government had privately concluded by 1967 that the Vietnam War was unwinnable and that continued military escalation would not achieve American objectives. While Presidents Johnson and Nixon were simultaneously standing before the American public delivering confident speeches about progress, momentum, and the necessity of staying the course, meaning for consecutive American presidents knowingly sent young men to die in a war their own analysts had already determined could not be won and kept that assessment classified, so the dying could continue without public interference.
108.
The CIA's assassination manual, declassified in 1997, was a detailed practical guide written in 1954 with specific instructions for killing people in ways that would appear to be accidents. including techniques for staging drownings, falls, and traffic incidents. In the same year that manual was written, multiple foreign leaders who had become inconvenient to American foreign policy interests died in circumstances that were ruled accidental and coincidence. That becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence the more carefully anyone reads the actual contents of the document. The agency spent decades refusing to.
109.
Columbus Day became a federal holiday in 1934 primarily because the Knights of Columbus lobbied Congress aggressively for years to have it established. And textbooks were subsequently rewritten to provide the historical justification for celebrating a man who never actually set foot on North American soil, who sparked the colonization process that killed millions of indigenous people, and whose own contemporaries had documented his brutality in writing. Meaning one of America's official federal holidays exists largely because a Catholic fraternal organization wanted a Catholic Italian explorer on the calendar, and Congress complied without significant historical debate.
110.
110.
The
Indian Adoption Project placed Native American children with white families under a federal program running from 1958 to 1967, and internal government memos recovered decades out. Later explicitly described the forced removal and assimilation of Native children as a programmatic solution to what officials called the Indian problem. Language that revealed the program was never purely about child welfare, but was a continuation of the same eliminationist logic that had driven American hygienist policy for a century, repackaged in the bureaucratic language of social services to make cultural destruction sound like humanitarian intervention.
111.
111. The Tuskegee syphilis study enrolled 399 black men in Alabama in 1930 under the pretense of receiving free medical treatment, and then deliberately held treatment to observe how untreated syphilis destroyed the human body over time. And when penicillin became widely available in the 1940s and could have cured every single one of them, those men, the doctors running the study, actively deceived patients to keep them from seeking treatment elsewhere because curing them would have ended the experiment, and the study continued for 40 years until a whistleblower leaked it to the press in 1972. We just sat through 111 moments where the most powerful government on the planet looked its own people dead in the eye and chose money, power, or pure convenience over basic human decency. And the genuinely terrifying part is that this list could have been 300 points long without breaking a sweat. So here is the real question you should be sitting with right now if they did all of this, and we only found out decades later through leaked documents and whistleblowers. What exactly do you think is happening right now that nobody has leaked yet? If that question keeps you up at night the same way it keeps us up, hit that subscribe button because we are just getting started.